Psalm 91, the most powerful prayer in the Bible. Imagine a refuge so impenetrable, a fortress so mighty that no harm can touch you. Picture a divine sanctuary where anxiety, fear, sickness, and demonic oppression are powerless to breach the walls. Now, imagine that this sanctuary isn't made of bricks and mortar but is woven from the promises of the living God Himself. This is the essence of Psalm 91, a psalm that doesn't merely promise protection, it guarantees it under divine conditions. A call to hope. In a world teeming with uncertainty, fear is the currency of the day. Disease ravages the earth, violence echoes through cities, and invisible forces of darkness seem to claim the lives of the unprepared. As believers, we sometimes wrestle with these dark realities, wondering if we are truly shielded from the chaos outside. But Psalm 91, known to many as the soldier's prayer, stands as an eternal reminder that in the presence of God, there is no fear, only peace, no harm, only protection, and no defeat, only victory. This powerful prayer transcends time and culture, offering a blueprint for supernatural protection for every believer. Setting the stage for spiritual warfare. Psalm 91 is not merely a poetic prayer, it is a battle cry. It speaks of spiritual warfare, the clash between divine forces of protection and the powers of darkness. The hidden message here is that the believer is not just called to survive but to thrive in the shelter of the Almighty, clothed in His invincible armor. Here lies the question that demands an answer: can any evil touch you if God is your fortress? The Word says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." Psalm 91 verse 1. This opening verse holds a deep spiritual revelation. Dwelling in God's shelter is not just a passive experience, it's an intentional, intimate relationship. The Hebrew word for dwell, yashav, conveys the idea of remaining, sitting, and abiding. It signifies a continual, active, and present engagement with the divine. It's the difference between knowing about God's protection and living under it. The condition of divine protection, intimacy with God. Psalm 91 begins with a condition: he who dwells. It does not promise this supernatural protection to everyone but only to those who dwell in God's presence. This raises a question that every believer must answer: are you dwelling, or are you visiting? Many people visit the presence of God during times of crisis, praying frantically when trouble looms, only to forget Him once the storm has passed. But this psalm speaks to those who abide, those whose lives are a constant pursuit of His presence, not a fleeting glance during difficult seasons. Psalm 91 is a covenant, not just a casual promise. Divine shelter in the shadow of the Almighty. The promise of divine protection is rooted in the imagery of God as a shelter. A shelter provides cover from the storm, but to experience it, you must be willing to take refuge. The word Almighty in this context is El Shaddai, one of God's most powerful names, meaning the all-sufficient one or the God of more than enough. When you are under the shadow of El Shaddai, you are under the care of the God whose power has no limits. No evil force can outmatch His sufficiency. The shadow of the Almighty doesn't imply darkness but a covering of divine grace. It implies that the believer is so close to God that they are walking in His immediate presence, shielded by His glory. Divine protection promised. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Psalm 91 verse 2. This verse shifts from declaration to personal confession, where the psalmist makes a bold statement of trust. It's not enough to know that God is a fortress, you must confess it, align your faith with that truth, and boldly declare it over your life. The act of speaking this truth activates the divine promise. A refuge and fortress. God is depicted as both a refuge and a fortress, showing both His gentleness and strength. As a refuge, He is a place of solace and comfort. As a fortress, He is impenetrable to attacks. Trust in God is not passive but a deliberate action that requires surrendering fear and uncertainty to His sovereignty. Revelation of God's protection in the supernatural realm. As we explore verses 3 to 4, we find deeper spiritual truths. The snare of the fowler represents the traps of the enemy, subtle attacks designed to capture the soul. Yet the promise is that God will deliver you from these hidden dangers. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings, you will find refuge. In biblical times, the image of a mother bird covering her young with her wings was one of the most profound symbols of protection. God uses this intimate metaphor to describe His care. His faithfulness becomes the armor that shields you, not only from physical dangers but also from spiritual ones. Fearless in the face of danger. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day. Psalm 91 verse 5. This part of Psalm 91 deals with the concept of fearlessness and faith. In a world driven by anxiety and insecurity, this verse promises the believer freedom from the fear that cripples the human spirit. Whether it's the terror of night, representing unseen forces, or the arrow by day, representing tangible attacks, the believer is called to walk in absolute confidence. The night and day of spiritual battles. In the spiritual realm, battles are fought both in the visible and invisible realms. But God's protection transcends both. No fear. The promise of no fear in these verses is a direct command for believers to cast all anxiety onto God. Spiritual insight. The spiritual darkness that haunts the night cannot withstand the light of God's presence. When you dwell in a shadow, the demonic forces lurking in the dark lose their power over your life. The arrow that flies by day can be symbolic of slander, attacks on your reputation, or sudden calamities, but with God as your shield, they have no place. Assurance of victory in times of plague. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. Psalm 91 verse 7. Here, we witness a vivid image of battle. The believer is surrounded by destruction, chaos, and death, yet they stand untouched. Why? Because God is not just protecting you, He's setting you apart. You are not subject to the destruction that afflicts those who are outside of God's covenant. Spiritual plagues. Today's plagues may not resemble the ones in the Old Testament, but spiritual plagues of depression, anxiety, disease, and fear often claim lives. Psalm 91 stands as an antidote for such plagues, assuring believers that they will emerge victorious even when surrounded by devastation. The supernatural ministry of angels. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. Psalm 91 verse 11. God's angels are not just passive observers, they are His warriors, charged with protecting His people. When you dwell in God's presence, angelic forces are dispatched to guard you against spiritual and physical harm. Ministering spirits. The Bible reveals that angels are ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. These beings, under God's command, surround the believer, offering supernatural protection. God's unshakable promise. The final verses of Psalm 91 summarize God's covenant with those who love Him. Because He loves me, I will rescue him, I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. Psalm 91 verse 14. This is God's personal promise, rooted in His love for us and our acknowledgement of His authority. God's love is not conditional, but His promises of protection are bound to our relationship with Him. This part of the psalm reiterates that the closer we draw to God, the more secure we are in His embrace. Conclusion. The fundamentals of living in Psalm 91. The power of Psalm 91 lies not just in reading it but in living it. Its promises are for those who dwell, abide, and trust in the Most High. The spiritual truths contained within these verses are vast, but the central message remains clear: God is your refuge, your fortress, and your deliverer. Key fundamentals to embrace. Abiding in God's presence. Make dwelling in God's presence a lifestyle, not an emergency strategy. Speaking and confessing God's word. Activate God's promises by confessing them over your life. Trust in God's protection. Know that God is faithful to deliver you from all harm, both seen and unseen. Powerful confession. Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. I believe that no harm will overtake me, no disaster will come near my home, for you command your angels concerning me to guard me in all my ways. I stand firm in your word, and I live under the shadow of your wings. In embracing this truth, you align yourself with the divine promise of Psalm 91, protection, peace, and divine favor all the days of your life. This framework lays out the powerful truths of Psalm 91 while ensuring that the content is spiritually revealing, deeply emotional, and humanized, appealing to a broad audience seeking both comfort and revelation in God's Word. Kindly subscribe, like, follow, comment and share.